Computer. And welcome to Robin Rotenberg. We're so happy to have you with us. You can remain muted, and if you have something to say, feel free to unmute yourself, but Robin is taking it away. Go right ahead. We welcome you, Robin.
Thanks so much, Elisa. And this is really a privilege for me to be talking to a hometown audience. I'm so thrilled to be talking to some fellow Torontonians. Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to spend a little time with all of you. And thank you for the kind introduction. It always sounds a little strange to me when I hear the things that people say about me or that they read out, because in my heart of hearts, I'm just a Toronto girl who went to summer camp in Northern Ontario. Now we joke that I only camp in 5-star hotels, but that's where I grew up, and those are the things that I had done. I started writing when I was starting to transition out of the corporate world. So I started my career, like I said, as a summer camp counselor. Then I was a special education teacher. And I found I couldn't help the children as much as I wanted to. So I went to law school fully intending to be a children's rights advocate. And then I took family law. And for any of you who have been involved at all in family law, I just thought I am way too emotional for this. I do not want to fight over people's children. I'd rather fight over their money. Their businesses are their babies too, but it's a little bit different than if you're really fighting over people's families. So that led me into the commercial world and the commercial legal world, where I practiced for a while as a commercial trial lawyer. And then when my daughter was a baby, I went in-house to a corporation, which was, if any of you have worked in companies, a whole other world. And the company that I went to and stayed at for 25 years is European-based. In fact, it's a German company, which was also somewhat of a cultural shock. And mostly men, mostly engineers, mostly male scientists, and an entirely different culture than being in a group of professionals or being with fellow native English speakers, because it's an entirely different world. And when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, transitioning out and having had all of this different experience that Elisa had talked about, I started to realize that women were coming to me for advice. And I thought, why are people coming to me for advice? What do I have to tell them? But over the course of time, people started coming more and more, some men, but mostly women. And I realized too that they were receiving so many negative messages from the Me Too movement, from Time's Up, especially in corporations here in the US, especially. And I ended up in the US because I married a New York City boy who thinks there's nothing north of the 49th parallel. So that's how I ended up here. And as Elisa and I had talked about today, usually with Torontonians, Toronto Jews don't go anywhere. We usually stay put and everybody comes to us. But he asked me to move to the US. So I got transferred from the president job to the communications job. But when I was transitioning out, and I knew I was going to transition out because after over 20 years, there was nothing left really for me to do there without relocating either to Europe or to somewhere else. And they restructured 5 or 6 times and kept changing the jobs. The VP job that I had 5 bosses in 10 years, in the first 10 years, 5 in the States and 2 or 3 in Europe. So every time you turned around, it was like having a different job with a whole new set of parameters and expectations. But when I was trying to step out, I thought, what am I going to do and how am I going to help other women? And quite frankly, along the way, I had had very, very little help from other women. From the law firms that I started in, either there weren't women or the women who were there weren't helping any of us who were new to the profession. And the reason that women were coming to me was, I think, because they felt comfortable. There weren't formal mentoring programs, and they thought, well, maybe she can help me sculpt my career. So I started to research gender equality in the workplace and all kinds of other interesting women's issues. I started getting really mad at all of the things that I was finding. And you folks don't know me, but if you give me a topic, I'll research it to death to try to figure out what am I dealing with and what does the research show. And I started talking to my friends, my fellow alphas, and said to them, what are your stories? What are your stories like? What do you have to tell from your positive, attainable careers? And the idea was to give earlier in career women and all women the idea that you can have a successful career, but you also have to look at it in a positive way and hear positive stories from women in attainable careers. We're not Oprah, we're not Sheryl Sandberg, we're just ordinary women going about our business, trying to figure out how do we get where we want to go. And I realized that out of the women I knew, I also knew a lot of alphas. So I decided to put them in a book. And the book is really a sort of conglomeration of a lot of things. And at the beginning of the book, I put in timelines of women's rights in the US and Canada. There's a Canadian timeline in it of how far women have come and how far, frankly, we have left to go. But it marks the different things that happened that have given women more equality in the workplace and more gender equality generally. So that's in the book. I also define what an alpha woman is, and I developed an axis, what I call the Rotenberg Axis, that has different characteristics of what women are as alphas, because defining a woman as an alpha is something really new. It's both evolutionary and revolutionary at the same time, because women evolve into our careers and into what we become. But it's also a different kind of concept to think about women as alphas, because usually we think of alphas as an alpha male or somebody really dominant. We don't think of women in that kind of context. And when you start looking at the different characteristics of alpha women, there are a lot of things that we are that help us to evolve into our careers. And what I did on this axis was I assigned points to the different characteristics. So everybody who wants to know where they are on the alpha scale can find out. And I have tips for advancing to the next level. There are 5 levels, and the first initial spell alpha, because otherwise I can never remember it either. So it's attempting, learning, professional, hard driving, and absolutely alpha, who absolutely rocks. So there's 5 different categories. And I have a scoring guide where you can figure out which alpha you are and add it up, and a tip sheet for how to get to the next level. If anybody wants it, you can just email me. I'll give you my email coordinates afterwards. And you can email me and I'll send you the scoring guide, and you can share it with whomever you have to share it with, any other alphas. But I thought what I could do tonight is tell you a little bit about the alpha women who are in my book, because they are really interesting. There are, in addition to me, not saying that I'm interesting, but these women really are. There are 7 of us, including me, and 4 of us are Jewish. We were raised in Jewish observant families. 2 had Jewish grandparents, so there was intermarriage even at the grandparent level. And 1 is from Taiwan originally. So let me tell you a little bit about my alphas. And I know all of these women personally. I was going to interview alphas that I just was impressed with, or people that I knew as colleagues, but I decided I was going to interview my friends and colleagues because I knew them best. And I asked them, instead of the usual thing, if you've ever been on a panel and you sit on a professional panel, people say, what do you think about your job? How did you get where you are? What kinds of things helped you in your career? They don't say, where did you come from? So the questions that I asked my alphas, and I list them, they're in the book, talk about their backgrounds and who they are as people, and who had the most influence on them growing up, and what had the most influence on them growing up. And then talks about their career and their current life, and what advice they would give to women coming up behind us. And what was really interesting was every one of them, I had them each do, except for 1 who refused, do the first draft of their alpha story, just to get them to put pen to paper and talk about themselves, because it's not easy to talk about yourself. And in fact, you'll see I'll gloss over mine. It's much easier for me to talk about other people, and it generally is. But they found it really cathartic, because they said they had never really reflected on how they got where they where they did and who influenced them. All they had really thought about was their careers or in the moment or managing who was going to feed the dog that night for dinner. And I often think about, I had to present an award or accept an award for BASF, and it was from the Atlantic, which is a magazine in the States. And at the same honor dinner, they had honored Elon Musk, who was there talking about his trips to Mars, his desired trips to Mars, how he was building the Tesla. And I turned to a colleague and I said, I'm just worried about who's going to feed the dog. This guy gets up every morning and wonders, how are we going to get to Mars? So there's a whole other level of what people think about. And I mean, as alpha women, we're not generally thinking about getting to Mars every day, even though Mars has been somewhat in the news. We're generally thinking about how do we juggle and figure out where we're going to find dinner for the dog or who's going to help us with our daily tasks. We're not thinking big picture. And one of the things that came out of all of this work is that I think women need to be more intentional about our careers and about where we're going and what we're doing, because the job opportunities that I had in many ways fell on me. People came to me, and I got a phone call one day when I was the lawyer for BASF Canada from one of the board members, the German board members. And he said, how would you like to be president of this company? The president's retiring. Do you want his job? I had no idea that I was being considered for it. I had no idea that he was retiring. And I hadn't done anything to prepare myself for the job either. Like, every time somebody retired when I was at BASF in Canada, they gave me their job. So by the time they asked me if I wanted to run the business, I was running communications, real estate, insurance. I was running the pension plan, which had billions of dollars in it. I had no idea what I was doing at first. The only thing I knew about pensions was about the things that I was investing in, which was like, $100 at a time at the time. And we weren't talking billions of dollars. But I realized that you can teach yourself a lot of things. And if you're open to it, you can figure it out. And there are people who will help you. But if I had been more intentional, I asked myself, is that the job I would have aimed for? So whatever we're doing in our lives, I think we need to be intentional about it. And what I found with the alpha women is most of us were not intentional about it. Things fell on us. We didn't like what we were doing, so we chose a different path. And let me give you a few examples. The one woman who's not Jewish, who's an immigrant from Taiwan, is Irene Chang Britt. And she ended up being the head of Sara Lee, which is a cake company. And she had also worked for Campbell's. And I met her at an event where we were both speaking. And I was introduced to her and she said, where are you from? I said, Toronto. She said, so am I. I said, where did you grow up? She said, Bayview and Shepherd. I said, so did I. What high school did you go to? Earl Haig. What about you? So did I. Like, she was a few years younger than me, but it was like an unbelievable coincidence among probably 1,000 people that I was introduced to her, and we were from 2 streets away from each other. But her family, I didn't know her family, but they were probably the one Asian family in the high school that I went to at the time, because Bayview and Shepherd's a lot different now. But back then, there were very few, you were either Christian or you were Jewish. There were really not very many other types of students. But she ended up here in the States. She now goes back and forth, but she has this incredible story of all the failures that she had encountered. But the interesting thing about Irene is she wasn't really intentional about it, but she had a lot of trouble in terms of her race, which is also a theme that's kind of spread through the alphas. So much so, she was the one who said to me, I'm not writing anything, you write it for me. So I interviewed her 3 or 4 times and I wrote her story and I gave it to her. And she said, you can't publish this. There's too much racism in it. My brothers and sisters will be really upset if they read what happened to me when I was growing up. So I wrote it again and toned it down. But what's in this book is probably the 5th draft. of Irene's story. And right up until the last minute, she said, and I had said, if you don't want to be in it, that's fine. If you're afraid to tell the story. And she, right up until the last minute, she said, I don't know if I should tell my story. Now, this is a woman who is the head of a Fortune 500 company. She sits on 8 boards now. She has an incredible story to tell, very motivating. She helps everybody. And she was afraid to tell her story. So it tells you something about all of us and how little we want to share about adversity. And that's one of the reasons I said to her, your story is so important. I totally understand. You don't have to publish anything. You don't have to print it, but your story is very important. You're the only immigrant. You're the only woman of color. You're the only one who headed up a Fortune 500 company. So her story is in here, but among us, under our cone of silence, she did not want to tell it. Cavello, who was an articling friend of mine, we shared an office for a long time. She had her own practice for quite a long time. Comes from way up north in Thunder Bay, I think. And she had wanted to be an astronaut. She had all kinds of different ideas about things that she wanted to be, but nearly died as a teenager from type 1 diabetes. So she had all kinds of different physical things to overcome. And one of the first times I walked into my office that I was sharing with her, she was giving herself her insulin shot in her leg. And I thought, okay, we're going to be good friends, but I have no idea what you've got in that needle. Maybe you should explain that to me. But she had all kinds of different dreams. She basically ran away from Thunder Bay for bigger and better things, but had all of this adversity around her health that she hid extremely well. And nobody really knew about it. And she has a very interesting family history because her mother found out that she had a Jewish parent or grandparent, I think it was a grandparent, that they hid. And they hid the fact that they were Jewish. And she found out as an older adult that she had a Jewish grandparent or great grandparent. And a lot of abandonment in the family where the men would go off to work and never come back. So at the grandparent level, they had a lot of adversity, but a lot of emphasis on education. Sally Glick, I met at a meeting of women. You know, they have these women-only, invitation-only dinners that they invite you to, which I generally hate and don't go to. But they invited me to one, and I had the good fortune to sit beside Sally. And since she's a Jewish woman originally from Chicago, the first time that I met her, we started sort of playing geography around, you know, who do we know? Everybody who has seen this book that I've done a talk for knows Sally. She's a marketing person for an accounting firm. She's actually a partner in the accounting firm. She's not an accountant. Her father was an accountant and she started her career with him. And I had been speaking to another author in Atlanta who was just coming out with a book. And he said, oh, I read your book and I saw Sally in there. How do you know Sally? And this is an author in Atlanta. I had no idea how I would have met up with her, but she's an incredible marketer, an incredible mentor. She's in the New Jersey Hall of Fame for business. And she just plugs away every day. The other day I called her up and I said, I would really like to I also write children's books. That was what I was doing during quarantine. We're not talking about COVID, but that's one of the things I did during quarantine was write a series of children's books. And I said, I'd like to give some away to children's charities in the area. Within half an hour, I had received emails from 4 CEOs of charities that served women and children. This woman is like a powerhouse, very unassuming, unbelievable marketer, knows everybody, and has an interesting story because she raised 3 kids alone while she was building all of this. Cheryl Goldhart also is, if you've been in the family law circuit in Toronto, is a very well-known award-winning family law lawyer, a law school friend of mine who had wanted to be a comedian. Her father used to leave notes on her bed saying comedians don't make any money. That's not a good thing to do. She dropped out of high school, went to work in her mother's jewelry store. And the jewelry store is still there. It's now run by her sister. It's called Vicky's Antiques. It's at Bathurst and Eglinton. And so she was working in the store. She decided she wasn't going to finish school. Her parents were not happy, but nobody in their family had gone to college, so it wasn't that unheard of that they didn't continue in education. But she has this story that one day she was serving a woman in the store, one of her mom's regulars, some woman, a very wealthy woman who used to come in when she was bored and buy some kind of bauble or whatever. She pulled up in a Rolls Royce on Eglinton Avenue and parked the car in front of the store. And she came in and Cheryl was serving the woman and showing her all kinds of things. And the woman said to her, I'd like to see this and this and this. And Cheryl said, I'd like to see your car. I'd love to see your car. Can I go out and look at it? And this woman said to her, that's fine, dear. And while you're out there, why don't you wash it for me? And it was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. That was it for her. She went back and she finished high school. She went to York University. She graduated at the top of our law school class. But when you think about the influences on women and the things that happened to us, that woman was so incredibly mean and degrading and demeaning to her that it just lit a fire in her to continue on and to go back. And she said to me, she said, nobody was ever going to treat me like that again. And what's interesting is her father is a really wealthy businessman. So she could have also gone into business with him, very successful. He had inherited an automotive parts business from his uncle and also did very, very well with it. But it's amazing what goes into it. And she told me when she started doing this work with me that she had not thought about that for years. She was working in the store during the day, going and doing stand-up in the comedy clubs in downtown Toronto at night. And then this woman said that to her, and it completely changed the course of her life. So very interesting. Lee Innocenti was a coach of mine. When I first moved to the US, they got me a coach. And I had a coach in Canada too, but I didn't realize how much of a shock it was going to be for me to move to the States. And it's all about scale. In Canada, at BSF Canada, it was $1 billion entity. The US entity is 20 billion. There were 6 or 7 manufacturing sites in Canada at the time. There are more now, but 6 or 7. There were 100 in the US. There were 700 employees in Canada. There are 20,000 in the US. So, and I had responsibility for the US, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So it's all about scale. And I thought, okay, I can do this. It's all in English, it's not French anymore, it's in Spanish, but I think I can do this. And my boss, who was pretty savvy at the time, and he was the CEO and later became the global CEO, he said, I'll get you a coach. I think you should have a coach. So Lee was my coach. She was incredibly helpful. And just as part of my story, when they first they do a review where they go and they talk to people about you, and they call it a 360 review, like back and forth. The team that I inherited, they had 6 bosses in the same job in 10 years. Most of them had only been there for 6 months. So most of the time they didn't have a boss at all. They figured, she's coming, she'll be here for 6 months. I was the first woman, I was the only non-American to have had the job. One of the guys had the job twice. He left the company and then came back. They couldn't get anybody to run this team. But so that was one issue. And then when Lee did the 360s, the people that I knew, my colleagues, they were okay, but the women hated me. They said, she's so quiet about it, probably because she's Canadian. We want her jumping up and down and doing things for women. I mean, it's a whole different environment. They have all of these different employee resource groups that in Canada just didn't exist at the time. So it was really quite a big culture shock, but Lee helped me with that. Lee had a Jewish grandparent who had abandoned the family. So she had some interesting things that had happened in her background. She now lives with her mom in Florida. Her mom's 104, and she takes care of her mom. And she's married. She's very funny and very savvy. And she was the one when I went to her and I said, I'm thinking about writing this book. I went to her in Florida because we were in Florida on vacation, and she, as I said, now lives there. And she said, you have to write this book. She said, you have to write it, tell our stories, let us tell our stories. And she was helpful to me every step of the way, even though she wasn't my coach anymore. She had a big corporate career. She also started as a teacher, but she stepped away from that to have her own coaching business, and it was very successful. The final alpha is Amy London, who's a Broadway singer. And I went to summer camp with her, and we reconnected when I moved to New Jersey. And it just happened when I moved here that, camps, sometimes people come looking for you. And she had come looking for me, and I'd had a different name for a long time. And then when I went back to Rotenberg, which is my maiden name, and it turned out she lived in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is about 10 minutes from where I live now. And she had quite an interesting time coming up as a singer. She is very, very well trained and teaches at one of the universities. She had developed a jazz program and teaches jazz all over the world. She's really, really an interesting person, totally different than my other alphas because she's in the arts, except for Linda Cavallo, who also sings in jazz clubs when they're open. But it was pretty telling to hear her story. And she's from Cincinnati, and she had immigrant grandparents who really struggled. And if you look through all the rest of us, our parents were first generation Canadians. So we're second, but our parents were first. And most of us had immigrant grandparents from Europe. So what I noticed in going through all of the stories and putting them all together, and they're really, I think they're very motivating, they're very inspiring, although some of the alphas had such bad experiences, like in law, for example, both Cheryl and Linda, that they left for a while and then went on and did other things and then came back. But there were some really interesting common themes. So one of them is that we really work hard. I think that hard work really does pay off. And that was an interesting learning because sometimes people look at you and they say, oh, they had it so easy. This was handed to them or that was handed to them. But most of us really worked hard to get where we are. We also, I think, were really, really lucky. We were born into families that highly valued education, even for girls. And what you'll see, especially in my story, is that it was sort of a joke in my family, although I never thought it was funny, that my father always said he'd always wanted a boy because I was the first baby. And then he said he was kidding and he was just as happy when he found out he had a girl, but I never believed him. But by the same token, he offered me the same educational opportunities as he would have offered, in my family, anybody. And when I went to university, I was shocked that so many girls, their parents wouldn't pay for their educations. They would pay for their brothers' educations, but they wouldn't pay for the girls, for the young women. So that was really a big shock to me but all of us were born into families where education was seen as an incredible stepping stone, as something that was really important and really highly valued. And we also had very, very strong family values. We had a very strong upbringing in, if it wasn't really religious, it was culturally very strong. And that, I think, gave us a lot of grounding and a really good, strong sense of who we were. Another thing that I found that was really interesting was that a lot of us, and including me, almost all of us had experiences with mean girls, with other girls when we were growing up who were mean to us. For me, for example, I was kind of the quiet, shy, studious girl. And when I went to summer camp, I was basically ignored. And the mean girls at summer camp left such a huge impression on me that one of them, because I'm still in touch with Amy, but one of them, Amy was very popular because she was a performer. One of them sent me a note after the book came out saying, was I one of the mean girls? Because she, I don't think, had any self-awareness as a 10 or 12-year-old as to how she was treating the rest of us. And certainly she didn't understand the impact that she had on me and on others. And there's a lot of that in the book around how girls treat other girls and how women treat other women. And the Mean Girls really left a very big impression on most of us. And the lack of mentoring from other women also did. And it still does. And you look now, and there's, in the research that I did for the book, there's a phenomenon called the Queen Bee syndrome, which is just what it sounds like. That in corporations, you get one woman who's very high up and doesn't want any other women around her. Or the company thinks it's done its duty in terms of gender equalization, and then they don't put any other women in high level positions. So there's a lot to how gender discrimination works and how gender is perceived and gender works against you in certain circumstances. But the Mean Girls and the lack of other women mentors is something that's a very common thread among all the alphas. One of the other things, and I won't give it all away, is that we always had to have a village. You don't do anything alone. Kind of like when I was telling you, I was sitting and listening to Elon Musk talk about going to Mars, and I was figuring out who was going to feed the dog that night because I was running late. We have a village of people who help you, and that village of people helps you with your family life, and helps you with your children, and helps you educate your children, and can come together with you if you ever need help. The other thing that's in the book, and then if you have any questions, please feel free to just jump in, is about concepts. And I didn't want the book to be a textbook. It's not a textbook. It's really, I'm told it's an easy read, that it's very easy for people to sort of go start to finish and see what I'm trying to showcase and talk about. But there's a lot in it about the concepts that have an impact on women. And one of them, we talk a lot about the glass ceiling, and the glass ceiling is also in the title of the book, but we don't talk much about the glass cliff. And the glass cliff is a concept in which women are given opportunities, but usually in down times, or times that are really difficult. And if we're destined to fail, then because of things that are outside of our control, then that becomes often an excuse for the power structure to say, we're not giving it to anybody else like we just had because she failed. And that's something that I think we really need to be cognizant of. And when I think back on the jobs that I was given in the corporate world, they were all jobs where people had failed before me. And I was the only woman, or the first woman ever to be in those jobs. And it's a very interesting thing to think about now in hindsight. I was the first general counsel for BASF in Canada, the first woman. The man who came before me had multiple jobs kind of linked together, but he ended up leaving the company. He had some kind of dispute with a more senior person. So he left. The president job, I was the first woman, and the company had all kinds of problems and wasn't aligned with the US and wasn't aligned with Germany. They sent me in to dismantle it. So they sent me in to restructure. Like when we talk about restructuring a business, it can sound very glamorous. It's not glamorous, because you're looking at a slate of jobs, figuring out which ones you need and which ones you don't need, or how you can reconfigure them so that you can get what the businesses need done. And you have an impact, a tremendous impact on people's lives. So I went in and I was sent in to restructure. And I ended up with the Canadian company was probably 30% smaller after about 18 months. So yes, I can do it, but I didn't like the impact that I had on people's lives. And you try to do it in the best way that you can. But you look at the jobs that I had, they sent me in to do a job where they knew I would be hated for it. And then when I went into the VP job here in the States, I told you I was the 7th person in 10 years, and then nobody expected me to succeed. And one of the guys who had been my boss before when I was in Canada, he said to me, "Robin, failure is not an option." It's like, okay, no pressure here, no pressure here. Thank you so much. Because there's only so much you can do with a team that doesn't want you there. I ended up replacing a lot of the people in it But that also isn't a pleasant thing to do either. So you look at all of those different things and you think, okay, was I intentional or was I set up to fail? All of those things that the concepts started bringing to light. And one concept that I really liked that was in here is there's now a discussion of a labyrinth for women, where we lose women not just when they're butting their heads against the glass ceiling or pounding on the table. We lose women all along the way in the workforce. So what happens in the first couple of years if a woman decides she has other family obligations, then a man gets promoted and then they move like this. And then a little bit later, she steps out for a few years because she has a child and she wants to put things on hold. And which is absolutely fine. Then the same man continues with his career. And when she comes back in, if she can come back in, which is a whole other issue, then she's way down here and the other people that she started with are here and she's never going to catch up. And it also has a big impact in terms of wages and earnings and career paths, all of those things. It has a tremendous impact. So there are different concepts that apply to women in the workplace, but the glass cliff is one that I think is really interesting because nobody talks about it too much. We talk about the glass ceiling, but we don't talk about a glass cliff. I read a few things about men having a glass elevator, but which is also an interesting kind of concept. It's like, why do they get an elevator and we have to take the stairs? But they're all things that make sense when you look at them in their totality. So I have that in the book too, just about different concepts and a little bit of research. And because I'm a nerd at heart, I had to do my research and put it in the book, and also to give it credibility so that it wasn't just a couple of stories about some women that I had known that are nice to tell, but don't have any grounding in science and having in social science and in science. And since I was in a science company for so much of my career, I know you need data before anybody believes you about anything. So I wanted to make sure that I had included enough data. But I have a number of other things in the book, but that's kind of the synopsis of it, a little bit about me, a little bit about why I wrote it, a little bit about all of the women who are in it. And I think we're right at 7:45. So if if anybody has any questions or any comments, anything that you'd like to know, I do have a website if you want to see a little bit more about me. It's called, it's www.alphawomenrock.com. And the heading on it is Make Your Own Rules, because that's my rule, is to always make your own rules, because whatever I was given to do in my career, everybody told me not to do it and I didn't listen to them. But I think it's got some interesting sort of things on it. It's got some advice and some blogs, and I'm also on Facebook and Instagram under Alpha Women Rock also. So you can find me there. And I'm just thinking if there's something else I needed to tell you. In Canada, if anybody's interested in buying the book, please buy it on Amazon rather than on my website, because it'll take forever and the shipping is exorbitantly expensive from the printer in the US.
Yeah,
so,
we put that link in the e-blasts this whole past week. Just look at any of your e-blasts from the song Shul and click here to order the book, and it takes you right to Amazon. So you should be able to get that easily.
Yeah, just so that you can see it. But that's kind of the synopsis of it and what I was trying to do. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you. I'm really thrilled to share the story and bring a little non-COVID relief to our day.
Agreed. Thank you so much. People, if you would like to ask a question, if you're on screen, actually I don't see everybody. So the best thing to do, please type your question in the chat line, and you can address it to everyone or to me. I prefer that you address it to everyone, and I will read it out to share. Actually, I can't believe Amy London is in that book. I'm an old friend of Amy London. We worked together in New York. I lived in New York in the 80s and 90s, and we sang together in 2 different jazz ensembles. and we subbed for each other in big band, club dates. And she married an Israeli musician. I married an Israeli musician. So Cantor Simon is my second husband, for those of you who don't know. But
Right.
our then husbands were friends from Israel in the music world. Anyway, so I'm so excited that she's in your book. She is an
You loved her story.
incredible woman.
You had loved her story. That's really interesting. And I saw your face kind of light up when I mentioned her name. And it's she's not married to him anymore, Ronnie Ben-Hur.
Okay.
So long story, not
Okay.
fit for print.
And I'm not married to my then Israeli husband either. Israeli musician husbands are a challenge.
Yes.
So my ears perked up at a lot of things you were talking while we're waiting for people to ask their questions.
Sure.
When you were talking about Mean Girls, because I think everyone experiences Mean Girls. I don't know if it propels everyone to strength. I think some people may be propelled to positions of strength and developing their alpha womanhood. And I think other people crumble as a result of the Mean Girls. So what would you say is the difference between how you end up as a result of that whole mean girl treatment?
I think some of it has to do with your support system, whether you find other girls who are like you, whether somebody from the mean girl kind of group, they might reach out or they might not, of the sort of more popular girls, but it has to do with finding your own friends. I found girls who were like me, who were more studious, who were more quiet, because believe it or not, I'm actually really shy. So when my parents put me in like ballet and dance when I was 3 years old, I hid in the back for a year. So it's a little bit different for everybody. I think the other thing is if you have a strong family support system, if you have and other things that you do. So if you have a child who happens to be in that situation with mean people around them or mean girls around them, I always had a ton of activities that I did as a child, and I still do them. So I think that has to do with it. For me, I just didn't expect to be part of sort of the popular crowd. I wasn't expecting as a 9 or 10-year-old how mean the girls would be and how much they would exclude me. And I remember one of the girls who's a friend of Amy's, because it's like the summer camp girls, and she, as I had said, was always really popular. When I'll tell you a funny story, which will apply to everybody, but may mean something different to you. When her younger daughter was bat mitzvah, I was at the bat mitzvah, and there were 2 of the camp mean girls there too. And even at this point in my life, and this was not that long ago, because Amy had children later, I was really nervous about running into those mean girls. What was I going to wear? Were they going to be nice to me? And I remember talking to somebody about it at work and thinking, I have no idea why I'm so concerned about it, but it shows you the depth of the scar. It really can be it's very scarring. And you're absolutely right. You have to find ways to help other women and girls heal those scars by realizing their worth and by realizing that they're good at other things. But it does affect your confidence probably for most of your life, if not all of it, to have somebody socially exclude you to that extent. And they're mean.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, before I read this next question, I want to share a comment with you. This is not my presentation, it's Robin's, but if she and I were hanging out, I would be sharing this with her right now. I have a friend who got a divorce from a very, very abusive man. And when she was divorced, her parents gave her all these books written by abused women. And this is not an alpha woman story. This is something coming from what you were just saying about a strong foundation. My friend who read these books said, all of these books by abused women keep talking about, oh, I felt I deserved to be abused. It was so horrible. I felt I deserved it. And my friend said, but that was what was different, because the whole time my husband was treating me this way, I always said to myself, I don't deserve this. And she said the difference was her parents really instilled in her this amazing sense of self-worth. So I think for those of us who have daughters and grandchildren and young girls in our lives, I think it's good to do exactly what you were just pointing out, Robin, is just boost them up and make them strong. Okay, here come the questions. Are Canadian alpha women different from American, and why and how?
That's an interesting question. I think that Canadians and Americans, men and women, are very, very different from each other. To a point where, and Elisa and I were talking about this earlier today, to a shocking extent, because we think as Canadians growing up 75 kilometers from the border, that Americans are sort of like us, and Americans think that Canada is the 51st state, and it's not. American alpha women are much more vocal and are much more dogmatic about being women in any kind of workplace. They do not have the same reticence as Canadian women about speaking up for themselves. And that was the first thing that I noticed about the women. Remember I said when I was getting coached by Lee, she said that these women don't like you because you're not burning your bra and jumping up and down on the table for them, and you came out of a really high level position. They expected you to do more. Canadian alpha women are a little bit more subdued, I would guess, about how we, I mean, I straddle because I have dual citizenship, but in Canada, people find me very aggressive. And in the US, they find me timid. So I guess that about sums it up. Yes?
I'm American. My whole
Yes.
life in America, I was very refined. I moved here and they think I am so aggressive. And it's like, no, this is just like regular.
Yes.
I can't believe you just said that. I've been saying that since I moved to Canada. I've been saying, no, in America, I'm really very refined. This is like normal. Oh God, I love that you just said that.
It's really true. The other thing that's really different is that I've been involved in a lot of charitable work and charities in the US. And in the US, no one has any compunction about talking about money or asking for money. No matter where you go, people will ask you for money. In Canada, people hardly ever ask you for money like that. And if I went in asking for money in Canada, it was like, oh, that's not very demure. We don't really talk about that here. But in the US, everything is show me the money, the money, the money, the money. And it's a different kind of discussion around how to support. But yes, no, I get that all the time. Oh, you're so aggressive for a Canadian. Really? I think it's just me. And also because as I had said, I'm really quite shy. Although I've learned to overcome that, as you've probably seen. But my nature is quite shy. It was always really hard for me. And for somebody to say to me, you're aggressive, I think, oh, that's really an insult. But I don't think it's an insult. I think it's just, they're just not used to the kind of characteristics we have.
Yeah. Rivi, are you waving? Do you have a comment? Rivi, no, okay. We have another question here. Aren't all women sort of alpha women, just by virtue of the fact that women have so many things to juggle between family and work and balancing friendships, because women tend to be more supportive of their friends than men are? So
you've got a lot wrapped up into that question. I think that if you look at the Rotenberg Axis that I did, and you look at the different characteristics, every woman will find herself on there. What you do with the axis is you take 10 characteristics that best describe you now, and you add up the points that are ascribed to them. In terms of being supportive of friends, I mean, I think women have a ton of responsibility always. I mean, men do too, but I think women's responsibility is different. And there's this whole concept in the research around taking care versus taking charge, and how women take care and men take charge, and how it's hard for entities like corporations to see women who can take charge and also be empathetic. And on my axis, for example, there's an IQ and there's an EQ axis, or an emotional quotient and an intelligence quotient, because you don't want to leave a whole bunch of dead bodies in your wake as you're ascending the alpha scale. But I think if you have a group of supportive women around you as your friends, you're really, really lucky. And keep it and build it and nurture it, because you'll never find anything else like it. And I'm really lucky to have good friends who have supported me through many trials and tribulations of my life. But I do think that there are alpha characteristics for all women we can all develop, but there's this taking care versus taking charge dichotomy that appears a lot in the research around just how women are wired, because we know our brains are different, and the types of social responsibilities that either we take on or we're expected to take on. So I'm not sure that answered it. Did that answer the question? Because there was a lot packed in the question.
There was a lot. I just shared it with everyone. So you should be able to now see it. This did not come from me. It came to me. But because it came to me, I figured somebody did not want to be identified.
That's okay.
I'm assuming, I'm hoping that answered. Anybody else? Any comments? It doesn't have to be a question. You are most welcome to unmute yourself and comment. That is what we are here for. Oh, we have such a quiet group this evening.
Everyone's tired.
Everyone is tired. Everyone is tired of COVID. Everyone is tired of isolation. And
yes, it's horrible, isn't it? I mean, and we have down here, they just came out with new Center for Disease Control, this CDC guidelines saying that if you're vaccinated, which we were lucky enough to be vaccinated, you don't have to wear your mask if you're outside. So I'm hoping, I don't want to focus too much on it because I'm incredibly grateful. And I think we should all be really grateful. And that's what I was saying to you also this afternoon, is whatever it is, we'll do it, because I think that on the other side of this, if we come out healthy, we're all fine. And that's really just the most important thing. I'm just really grateful. I'm also grateful that I have a yard, because last summer we could sit out, we could sit outside. And today here it was almost 30 degrees. So, which was a little bizarre because yesterday it was 10, but that's okay. But I think we have a lot to be grateful for and a lot to look forward to. But I do think people are tired. They're tired and they're fed up. And here in the US, I think it's a big lesson that just in terms of the differences between Canada and the US, how many people have politicized the whole issue around mask wearing and vaccination. It's, as a Canadian, I just a lot of Americans are shaking their head too, but as a Canadian, it really makes me shake my head and think, these scientists are brilliant. I worked with scientists for a long time, and they may not want to talk to you over lunch, but they certainly know what they're doing in a lab. And they proved that this year.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Robin. I am so excited that you were part of the Song Shul this evening. And we are all grateful. I thank all of you for joining. It's always nice seeing my friends, even if you're hiding behind your name on a black screen, but glad to know you are with us. Our speaker series continues next Wednesday and the follow, I think it's Wednesday, maybe it's Sunday, I don't even remember. You got to look at your e-blast or look at the website. But for now, Robin, I wish you enormous success with your book. Absolutely, we can applaud this marvelous hour. I wish you health. I know your daughter is here in Toronto, so good luck getting past the border and past quarantine. And if you're ever here when the Song Shul is in session, please come in and we will welcome you in person with open arms. And really, thank you so much. And thanks, everyone. I wish you all a great night, great health, and let us all be together for good things and for enjoyment in person in good health. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody. Bye.